Hi everyone, Jonathan here again with another episode of What is This Weapon? Now, this one was inspired by a visit to the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. The guys there very kindly invited me down. It was an amazing experience, but it really got me thinking about aircraft guns and that people who are into historical firearms don't necessarily know that much about aircraft, and people who are into aircraft don't usually know that much about the guns. So for my own education as well, and to bring you guys something interesting, I wanted to dive a little bit down this rabbit hole. So the gun in front of me, you've probably gathered already, is a Browning machine gun of some kind. And with me burbling about British aircraft guns already, you've probably figured out it's a 303 aircraft machine gun, Browning type. That much is maybe not clear, but you could probably figure that out from staring at it long enough. The front end of this does look different though. If you're furiously Googling Browning aircraft guns or thinking that doesn't quite look what I remember from my Airfix kits as a kid, it's because this is a very early example that we're very fortunate to have in the collection. So it has, long story short, it does not have the same muzzle device that we'll see on a couple of fully developed guns that I'll show you in a moment. Different barrel jacket. The back end basically looks like what you'd expect to see pulled out of a Spitfire or something. The real critical information is on the top of the gun, the top plate, which we'll show you. And it does reveal that this is a Colt aircraft machine gun, Browning patents, I guess Browning patents apply, Cal .303, MG40. And that is the Colt model number for this commercial aircraft machine gun. So this is a John Moses Browning design, brilliantly robust, classic machine gun design, still around in the form of the M250 caliber. All the same family of guns here. MG40, 40 is not a reference to the year 1940, it's just the in-house Colt numbering system. That's not too widely known, just to explain why it's called MG40. We've got a serial number, we've got manufactured by, and then the Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, Hartford, Connecticut, USA, which you'd expect to see on pretty much any Colt firearm, and then a whole raft of patent numbers that we won't dive into. So this is an American-made gun. Now in 1931, Colt demonstrated at the Vickers Crayford Works to the Air Ministry their candidate for a fast-firing aircraft gun. The Air Ministry was looking, I think by 1930, for a new aircraft gun to replace the venerable Vickers. You've probably seen the old biplanes with the Vickers water-cooled gun with the jacket cut away. Yeah, they were essentially bodging ground guns onto aircraft, Lewis guns over the wing, that kind of thing. So there were a couple of candidates here. Vickers had a Class E offering that didn't really go anywhere. There was the French Darn as well. In 1932, we've got a handful of examples purchased for trials, and then flash forward to 1935, 60 guns is the initial purchase, and this is one of those 60 guns. But it's not just off the shelf. This isn't just an MG40. This one has already been modified to meet British requirements. A lot of minor details that we won't go into here. The big one is at the back of the gun. I'll show you that on a couple of other guns in a moment. But right at the back here, it's been modified. And it was modified because of cordite. You probably heard the smell of cordite as a phrase. It's not just an expression. It doesn't apply to all propellant in small arms ammunition. It's a specific British type of propellant. Looks like spaghetti, weirdly. An extruded form of nitrocellulose. It's what all British ammunition ran on, pretty much at this time. And it caused problems with fast-firing guns like this. This version did 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute. That's already pretty tasty. The Air Ministry wanted even more than that, and they upped it to 1,200 rounds per minute. So, you know, when 8 of these were in a Spitfire or a Hurricane in 1940, it's just a burst of, like a swarm of angry bees coming out of the front of the aircraft from both wings, 4 in each wing. Really quite astonishing rate of fire there. Now, the problem there with cordite, this very hot burning propellant that the British were using, and that very high rate of fire, is the gun stopped. It jammed. And to overcome that, they converted the closed bolt Browning design. So it normally fires with the bolt shut, so the round is sealed in the chamber, getting really nice and hot if it's been firing for a while or very fast. Converted it to open bolt. So that big operating bolt would sit at the back of the gun most of the time, allowing air to cool the chamber, so it would be less likely to cook off, to go off when you don't want it to, which at the very least is going to jam the gun up, could even blow the gun up. So a pretty undesirable situation. So that led to what they called the rear sear release. Now, we don't have to go into the technicalities of that too much, but that's what holds that breech block or that bolt at the back of the gun and releases it forward to chamber to chamber and fire the round that's already on the face of the breech, having been pulled backwards out of the belt. Just very briefly, belt of ammunition. These are 303 Browning links. So as the gun is you have to cock this thing twice. First cocking pulls the round out of the breech and then on the breech block. And then when it slams forward, when the pilot presses the trigger or the gunner presses the trigger in the turret, breech block slams forward, chambers and fires it. So that's the open bolt, closed bolt thing. Normally that's a technicality. Here it's absolutely critical because the gun couldn't work without it, not with British ammunition. So that is the MG40, but the final marking on this gun is actually what fairly hastily stamped Mark 1, MK1. So this would have been a trials gun, and it's then been modified with this rear sear capability inside at the back, stamped Mark 1. So that's this gun. If we transition to a couple of in-service types, I'll try and explain how fighters and bombers used the developed version of this gun to actually shoot down enemy aircraft. Right, so we've now got two representative guns in fighter and bomber trim, if you like, to try and better contextualize how the heck these things actually worked. You kind of need to see how they fit in the wing or into the turret. But as far as how the guns are set up to then put them into the wing or into the turret, I can show you that. So there are actually several marks of this gun. The only two you'll actually see in use in any footage or photos of the period are the Mark II and the Mark II Star. If you want to tell the difference between those two, well, the Mark II has a plain flash eliminator on the front here, rather than this finned design. That's really the only difference between the Mark II and the Mark II Star. However, for fitting in different installations, you may not even have this cone flash eliminator on the end. You might just have this flush sort of muzzle nut here that we see on the fighter version. Now, there's some discussion that early fighter installations, and I have seen a photo of this, had probably Mark II guns with the plain cone actually sticking out of the wing for some of the guns. But the vast, vast majority of Spitfires and Hurricanes that you will see, thinking sort of, Battle of Britain time here, summer to autumn 1940, the vast majority of those, you'll see nothing sticking out of the wing because it's this setup we're talking about. So let's look at this first. So again, that flush sort of nut on the front with this flanged muzzle device, it's pinned and welded in place. Both setups actually have a blast tube adapter, which would originally have had asbestos and copper strip on it. We haven't got that on here for obvious reasons. And that's how it sort of snugs into the wing installation so that it becomes a sort of a part of the wing, effectively. And there are two mounting brackets that we obviously can't show you here. And then the gun is basically the same as that trials gun from 1935-ish. So these are both Mark II Star guns. We've got one made, well, they're made by different manufacturers. BSA was the major manufacturer. Vickers was contracted to make slightly fewer, but you will find both of those around. And the very, very early guns were Colt made, as mentioned earlier. So the fighter installation, those are the critical bits at the front to actually effectively fit this thing into a wing. Now, I mentioned earlier with the rear sear release, and that's how you hold the breech block, the bolt, to the rear between shots so that the gun cools. Well, this is actually installed on this gun, and this is the pneumatic version, because in fighters, the gun was pneumatically activated. And that's what these two hoses are. So when the armourer offered the gun up to the wing, into the wing bay, it would be kitted out like this. So A, the rear sear release. Now that has a manual release because you have to be able to manually close the bolt. Otherwise, how would you, operate the gun when it's not powered by the pneumatic air? So it has a manual release lever. You see me pressing that there. So that will allow the thing to clunk forward. In fact, I can demonstrate that on the other gun in a bit. So that's essentially how the gun fires, but you actually need two triggers on this system. Because remember, this was not designed to fire with the bolt open like that. So that's only one of two means of firing it that both have to happen at the same time. So we have these two mechanisms, rear sear release and fire and safe. All that does is stick a bit of metal in front of the sear on the bolt. And that is how, well, one way or another, there are various different versions of this, that's how these Browning guns would normally fire, with the bolt closed, and then that's your trigger. Because of the British modification, you've now got two triggers. This one at the back, the rear sear release, and this one on the side, the fire and safe unit. So it's already pretty complicated, but all you need to remember is it's two hoses. You clamp those onto the attachment in the wing bay. You offer up your belt of ammunition, load it just like a normal Browning gun, cock it twice, and you're good to go. Now, if we check footage of this, you will see that in a fighter, they would actually close the bolt first. So the first shot would be with the bolt closed. Looks like a normal American gun. And then as soon as the pilot presses the pneumatic button on his firing spade grip, the first shot would be closed and then it would revert to being an open bolt. So that's the fighter installation. The bomber installation, you still need two triggers, but it depends is the answer for the bomber. So you've got a mixture of, primarily hydraulic operated. So if you think of your Lancaster bomber, you have hydraulic versions of these mechanisms. So I actually have an example of a hydraulic rear sear unit here. It's very, very similar indeed to the one on the fighter installation that's pneumatic. Pneumatic is obviously air pushing, applying pressure to activate mechanisms. Hydraulic uses oil, fluid. Well, technically air is a fluid, but a liquid. So very, very similar indeed. So in normal use, this gun would have this on the back of it, and the hydraulic hose would be attached to the back of it. The big difference is you don't have two hoses on a bomber turret installation, such as a tail gun turret from a Lancaster, or the top turret, or the nose turret for that matter. You have what's called a hand fire and safe unit. So that's on the side of this gun, and it is a slide. It's marked S and F. Think of it like a safety. Although it's still two triggers firing the gun, functionally it operates as your safety as a gunner in a turret. So just quickly to try and pull all that together, we have this one set up in armourer's trim. So it's as you would fit it in a turret with this hand unit on the side here, but the rear release is a manual one instead of the hydraulic one. And to cock it, we have this great big cocking lever on the side. So I'll show you that in a moment. Something I need to note though, if you ever see footage of these guys operating their turret guns, they didn't have cocking handles. Might sound crazy. The Bomber Command Memorial actually has an air gunner with his cocking tool sticking out of his boot. They had separate cocking tools, would you believe? But when you see how cramped these installations were, it sort of makes sense. There really wasn't room for something like this that gives you the leverage to actually cock the gun. It requires a pretty tremendous amount of force to do it. So they had typically a wire tool. We don't have any, or at least if we have them, I haven't found one yet, with a wooden handle and a loop on the end. It's all a bit kind of make do and mend, but you loop the end over the cocking handle and you yank to cock the thing. So imagine, if you will, this one without this cocking handle, because you have a separate tool for that. Maybe in your boot, although there's a designated storage area in the turret for that. And instead of this manual lever at the back, that I'll show you in a moment, you've got a hydraulic activation mechanism. Okay, so to try and sort of fully explain how this thing actually works, as though we're sort of set up for a turret, or maybe we're an armourer kind of talking it through, because we do have this manual cocking handle and a manual rear sear release, one of our two triggers. The other trigger would actually be fitted to the gun when it's mounted into the turret, and that is that hand fire and safe unit that is on the right hand side. Now we can't activate that with the breech block forwards. That's just how it works. So let me show you how this works. We open the top cover. We can use our handy manual handle to cock the gun, and the bolt hangs back on that rear sear. That was that very specific British modification to the gun. At that point, we're able to engage our fire and safe unit on the right, so that the gun would now fire when we release it forwards. I'm not going to load and run a belt of ammunition through this, because it does, these need to be in top condition, and I don't want to sort of overstress the gun too much by cranking the rounds through, but just to show you how the actual gun works. So with a hydraulic or an electrical release system in lieu of this armourer's release here, but the same effect. Let's press the handle. Breech block flies forward, and as long as that's set to fire, the gun fires. So whereas in the fighter, you've got two triggers that are activated simultaneously, in this case, you've activated one of them by hand, and the other one is just your firing triggers in the turret using hydraulics or electrical power to release this thing at the rear. So that's how it works. I hope that made a bit of sense for you. So that's the 303 aircraft Browning in the British service in a nutshell. Now, this was the main fighter armament and bomber armament in one way or another for most of the war. Other guns came in and were used. Most significantly for the fighters, the Hispano 20mm cannon. So as early as the Battle of Britain, one squadron trialled this massive, essentially a gigantic machine gun, 20mm caliber, firing about half the rate of the Browning, but firing much bigger, explosive and or armor-piercing shells, way more destructive to the fabric of an aircraft, control lines, fuel tanks, oil tanks, the pilot, the crew. So this then became an argument, essentially, between rifle caliber machine guns, burping away at 1,200 rounds per minute, or big chunky cannon pounding away. You can carry less ammunition with those. They're firing slower, so it's harder to hit a target moving across the sky. But if you hit them, they're probably going down. And all countries essentially came up with one or more. They would either go with one or the other, or a mixture. And that's what happened in British service. So we kept the Browning. We went from 8 or even 12 in some marks of Hurricane down to just 4 guns. And then we replaced the other 4 guns with 2 of those big cannon. So we had a mixed armament. You had 60 rounds per gun for the big Hispano and 350 rounds per gun for the Browning. So a nice compromise of ammunition capacity, destructive power, and ability to hit the enemy, essentially. And so that's the difference between your Mark 1 and 2 Spitfires. So the Spitfire is always the example that comes to mind. and the Mark 5B, the Mark 9, and the later Marks of Spitfire. All had a mixture of rifle caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon. Now, the later Spitfires had 50 caliber Big Brother Brownings, but they were still paired with that Hispano. So by 1945, this was arguably an obsolete gun, but it absolutely served certainly the British and Commonwealth forces extremely well throughout the Second World War. Cannon were the future, or maybe 50 cal machine guns if you're the Americans. But this thing is a legendary piece of British/American military equipment. And just a final thanks again to the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Thanks to Smithy for that wonderful visit and for really sparking or rekindling my interest in aircraft machine guns. As always, guys, thank you for watching. We actually have a new book coming out. I did contribute a couple of entries to this one. It's called The Treasures of the Royal Armouries. So it's a sort of lavishly illustrated book of some of our sort of highlight objects from the collection. So we have a link in the description if you'd like to check that out. As always, we have our social media outlets, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter that you might like to check out. And if you don't already follow us on Facebook and Instagram for this series, or the parallel to this series, What Is This Weapon?, you should really check that out, and you can have fun guessing what it is that we're pulling out of stores each time. Otherwise, guys, I'll see you again next time. Thank you very much for watching.